Okay, let me give Alan an introduction. He's a regular in this class, and I must say that we're all very, very, very appreciative of him taking his time because he's very busy to come and discuss genetically modified plants. And I really know of no one better to be able to do this because Alan not only has trained in that technology, meaning he's used it in his experiments and he's familiar with it, but he's probably knows more about regulating the release of transgenic plants into the environment than anyone that I know. He's served on many, many, many commissions, both in Canada and in the United States, and most recently on a select elite panel of the National Academy of Sciences to put out recommendations and to discuss the potential harm of, if any, of genetically modified plants. He's written, as you can see up here, 2 recent articles that came out in the Plant Biotech Journal, one of which you will get when you leave today, on how regulating transgenic crops has been working both in Canada and in the United States. And he also goes around as part of his job at UC Riverside talking to people in the state of California, lay groups, farmers, and so on and so forth about this technology and these crops. And so he knows everything from the science to the regulatory and everything in between. Alan's also been involved in many of the debates that have gone on in California, the referenda that have been carried out with respect to trying to ban genetically modified organisms in certain counties of the state of California, some of which have passed and some of which have not. And he also has written an award-winning book, and it was an award-winning book on genetically modified plants called Pandora's Picnic Basket, which is up here too. He has his PhD from Oxford. He did postdoctoral training at Yale and then was on the faculty of the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon, Canada, because he is Canadian, correct?
I am.
And then he moved to the University of California, Riverside, where he is in the Department of Botany and Plant Sciences, which is a very distinguished botany department. And he's going to talk to you about GMOs, what's all the fuss, using iClickers and everything else, and feel free to raise your hand, debate. You had debates yesterday. He knows that you had debates on these issues and had a discussion, and I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Alan McEwen. Alan, thank you so much, as always. You know how much I appreciate it.
Oh, thanks very much. Always a pleasure to be here. It's sometimes a relief to get out of Riverside, even having to drive in the rain. Okay, so we have a pointer. We do like to have this fairly informal. I know we have a little over an hour or so, and there are issues, but we can go all night. Super. Sounds good to me. I can miss the traffic on the way home. If you have burning issues, if you have questions, feel free, put up your hands and ask, because I think that's far more important that we address what you are interested in, your questions, your issues, than simply going through my potted presentation here. We are going to start with a pop quiz. Now, I know you're used to those, so you have your little clickers ready. Just to set the baseline, see where you are in comparison with the rest of America. You know, are U.S. foods in U.S. supermarkets? Do you know the answer to this question? I mean, do you eat GM foods regularly?
Vote up in Davis.
Well, they even have GM fish in Davis. All right, this is the start. I use GM here, genetically modified. It's primarily the European expression. In this country, we tend to say genetically engineered, or bioengineered, or transgenic, or product of recombinant DNA. Do I have to do that? 100%. Okay. So I use GM just to mean all of these things. There can be some subtle differences from different jurisdictions. We in the U.S., in the regulatory community, in the legal community, biotech, GM, GE can mean different things. And similarly, those same terms can mean something slightly different in Canada, in Europe, in Australia, New Zealand, and so on. So that can be confusing, but I'm just using GM generally. Do ordinary tomatoes contain genes? Oh, here we have some, finally, we have some individuals, okay.
Who said yes? Tom, did you say yes? Thomas, did you say yes?
No, I said no.
You said what?
I said no.
Why is the answer no?
Well, I'm assuming if it's just a generic fish gene, I guess if you put the specific fish taste gene into tomatoes, it would taste fishy, but just a regular gene would not cause fishy taste.
So who said it would? Lauren, did you say it would be fishy? Dora, did you say it would be fishy?
No.
Maria, did you say it would be fishy?
No.
Must have been Ryan up there. Either Ryan or Dr. Harada.
I think it was John.
Yeah, exactly.
That's right.
Okay,
Some people believe that, though, as Alan will tell you.
if you ate a genetically modified fruit, might it alter your own genes? Okay, let's start. I want to think about this a little bit. Stop first. We do the display. And again, a little bit of variation. A couple of people not quite sure.
So who said yes?
Oh,
A
yeah.
mistake?
After you saw the results of everyone else, you decided it was a mistake? This is, you're looking at the definition of a mutagen. I'm not sure that I would be much interested in eating any food product that would alter my own genes. And I don't recommend it to anyone else either. Can animal genes be inserted into a plant? Okay, this is a pure technology kind of question. It's not should they, it's can they. So technically, is it feasible to do it? I'm getting the hang of this now. I'll get to stop it first. And everybody said yes, okay?
They've been learning.
They have been. Okay, an example of the genetically modified food that's on the market, if you believe there are any. If you don't, then you can say there are none. And okay, somebody says we don't have any at all.
Most say they're all.
Most say that, 2/3 say that everything is genetically modified. Okay.
So who
We'll
said
come back to this.
that they're all genetically modified?
2/3.
Max, why is that? Daisy's going to give you a mic.
Genetic modification.
Speak up.
Genetic modification doesn't necessarily have to be genetic engineering. It could be selective breeding, and a lot of foods are selective bred.
See how sophisticated they've gotten?
This is great. Yeah, good.
Who else? Who said no? Ah, Kathy.
I said no because you don't find any of these in the wild, just as they are.
But are any of them in the grocery store modified? Is anything that you go, when you go to Whole Foods, do you find any of this genetically modified food?
Well, again, like Max said, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily genetically engineered. It just means that they didn't always exist in this way.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Who said wheat?
Who said wheat? Catherine.
Yes.
Why did you say wheat?
Was that one of the crops that we've been discussing in terms of wheat and rice and soybean and those kind of things? So I went with that.
Did it have genetically modified wheat in your article for yesterday?
Now that you say that, I can't remember, but
Yeah.
I lumped it with those.
Okay.
Okay. Have you eaten any food made from GM crops this week?
Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, go.
All right.
Mr. Miller, which ones have you eaten this week?
I had some tomatoes, soft, tomatoes.
So you think tomatoes are genetically engineered? Classical or molecular?
Classical and molecular, I know.
Okay, so both?
Yeah.
Who else? What else have you eaten this week that's genetically modified? GM now, not by breeding, just by modern.
A lot of the produce that I've had. Actually, I don't know because
You're
they've been
positive,
halls,
like.
and they've been trying this whole new organic push. So to be perfectly frank, I might not have because they've been doing everything.
Do you have any potato
organically.
chips this week?
I actually haven't.
Has anyone had any potato chips this week? Has anyone had any potato chips this week? Has anyone had any corn this week? Raise your hands. Davis, no corn? Has anyone had any soybeans this week? Has anyone drank any Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, or any soft drinks this week? You know, corn, fructose. Has anyone had any cereal this week? Like soybean byproducts? Well, Alan's going to answer that in the course of his lecture. Go ahead.
Should GM foods be labeled? All right, this one shouldn't take you long. Most people either have already made up their mind well in advance, and yeah, what's that? 8 seconds it took us. Oh, good split here.
Group. So who said yes? Eden said yes. The Garden of Eden said yes. Speak up.
Just in case there's any gene that produces a protein that someone would be allergic to, such as like a peanut gene, I feel like they should know what they're eating.
What if it's in another variety of peanut?
That's not genetically engineered.
It's engineered, well, or
Well,
that
if
that
it's,
is, either way.
if it's like a peanut that's genetically engineered so that people aren't allergic to it, then the people, if they know it's genetically engineered, could eat it. I don't know. I just thought that
Okay,
it's good to know.
Fair enough.
Who said yes? Stephen. Mr. Searles.
I just thought
Speak up.
in labeling, it's not much harm, and it's better for people to be able to have the option.
That's common enough opinion, sure.
What about in Davis? Who said yes? Who said no?
We both said yes.
Okay.
Oh, wait. No. We both said no.
I mean, no,
Okay.
yeah.
Yes, no, no, yes?
No.
No.
Okay, Faria, why?
I just, I think because so many foods are labeled, are like already modified that it doesn't make sense because a lot of what we eat is already genetically modified, so.
Who else said no here at UCLA? Brian.
Well, I just thought that because there's so many foods that are genetically modified, and it would be too expensive to try to label every single one. Every single one would say genetically modified on it.
Do you think that genetically modified foods should be labeled simply because of the technique to make them, or because what might be in them that could cause potential harm?
Well, I don't think they should be labeled. Well, because I guess since it's a natural process, we're just moving genes around. They don't need to be labeled. There's no reason to do it.
How many people said yes? How many of you have eaten soybeans in the last week? How many of you eaten peanuts in the last week? Samantha, how many people died last year around the world by eating conventionally bred peanuts due to an allergic reaction?
1,005.
Many thousands. So would you think that perhaps one might have to label peanut products that they might cause death?
Yeah, I believe that most products, even if you don't know if it actually has peanuts inside of it, it usually says this food was processed with maybe machinery that has touched peanuts or has peanut oil in it.
How about shrimp?
Shrimp's also something. Oh, labeling shrimp?
How many people are allergic to shellfish?
Yeah.
Anyways, go ahead, Alan.
Or dairy products.
Or dairy products.
Or
I'm allergic to dairy products.
right. So do you think everything that has some gene from a dairy organism should be labeled?
Maybe allergic's weird. I'm lactose intolerant. That's a little different, I guess.
Oh,
That's
sensitivity.
that's
It's still, I mean, you
allergenic.
want to
It's
know,
an allergy.
right? I mean, you want to know so you can avoid that food product because you don't want to get sick, right? And people who have allergies to peanuts or particularly severe allergies and going into anaphylactic shock, I mean, that can be life-threatening. So you want to know that. So if you have all these foods that are labeled, you know, may contain nuts, what do those people eat?
We'll get back to that issue.
Let's come back to this. Okay, here's where you get to compare. Actually, before we get on to this, I have a question that isn't on there. Do you think we should label organic foods? Just put up your hands. I know you can't use the clicker on this. Yes or no? Can we put it on? Okay, just... A and B. A is yes. B is no. Should organic foods be labeled? Okay, we have a split here. Organic foods are not labeled at the moment. It's not a mandatory label, it's a voluntary label. And some organic foods that don't measure up to standard are dumped into the conventional market without being labeled. And some of those have caused harm. In fact, some organic foods that have been labeled have caused harm as well and had to be removed from the market. So simply because it's organic, first of all, doesn't mean it's safe. And secondly, doesn't mean it's not genetically modified in the traditional sense. In fact, many of the organic crops, most popular organic crops, are produced through mutation breeding, using ionizing radiation to fracture the DNA and cause mutations that, in some cases, would have beneficial impact on the plant. Beneficial from a human standpoint, not necessarily from the plant standpoint. And those have been developed into crops. Organic farmers grow them, organic consumers eat them, and not only are they not labeled necessarily as being organic, they're not labeled as having been produced through the use of ionizing radiation. So let's ask that question on there as well. Okay. Sorry, well, Julia, why don't you ask a question? Make your point.
When you say organic foods have caused harm, do you mean like by E. coli or salmonella or something like that?
Not necessarily, but yes, that's one opportunity. You have mycotoxins as well. But ordinarily, organic foods they're not a major cause of concern. Okay, so we have our question. What was our question? Should foods developed using ionizing radiation be labeled, yes or no? Start again. No, hide that. Okay, nice, nice dichotomy here. Because ionizing radiation is, of course, a method of plant breeding. It's been in use for 60, 70 years now. And thousands of varieties of crops, particularly crops, animals aren't so keen on being radiated, have been developed using this technology. It's been very effective in some parts of the world and on particular crops, cereals, mostly rice. But most consumers are not aware that mutation breeding is even used in plant and crop development at all. So when you're looking or considering labeling, mandatory labeling of genetic engineering, because it's a process that you might have some concerns with, you might also want to consider other processes that we use in producing our foods, and ionizing radiation would be one of them.
What are the specific dangers posed by ionizing radiation, if any?
I didn't say there was any specific dangers,
Okay,
but
sorry.
consumers say they have a right to know
Oh.
what's in their food and how it was produced.
Okay.
And that's a different question. If there were specific dangers, you would have difficulty getting the product on the market in the first place. And this is true whether it was produced using ionizing radiation or genetic engineering or even old-fashioned crossing. Right. The regulatory system, not only in this country but worldwide, would keep those products off the market.
So how does that process work? Ionizing radiation, you just, I mean,
It splinters the DNA, breaks the DNA. It's a physical snapping of the DNA molecule. Then there's recombination. Now, you have to be very careful with the dose. If the dose is too high, you're going to shatter all the DNA and the thing will die.
Okay.
But if you have a low enough dose that only certain portions of the genome, only certain portions of the DNA break, then typically what you see is a loss of function. It destroys one gene or a small number of genes. Not enough to kill the plant, but enough to, say, give it a reduced height, which has been an important feature, particularly in cereals. Right? So most of our wheats, for example, are produced from dwarf wheat varieties. Similarly, rice. So the technique has been around for a while. It has been very effective at producing more food for humans, but that's our intent. Right? We're thwarting Mother Nature, who didn't really want the plant to be that short.
So the idea then is, Chris, that the ionizing radiation is being used to create genetic variability. So it's a mutagen that's seeding with the DNA replicatory process. So it's causing mutations not spontaneously, but induced mutations. And that variability is causing different alleles, and those different alleles then are then used, if they're useful, by the breeders to select for the crops that they want. So it's a means of inducing genetic variability artificially.
It's a very inefficient system, but it's made feasible because you can irradiate tens of thousands or millions of seeds at the same time, plants. And even if only one of those 10 million irradiated seeds turns out to be a mutant that's useful for humans, you can develop an entire crop from that single plant or that single seed. Right? Everything else, you just throw it away. Okay, so how do your results compare with the great American public? Let's take these surveys were taken. They're getting a little bit older now, but the fundamental results are substantially the same. So if we take a look at these, here are the questions that I asked originally. Are GM foods in U.S. supermarkets? Of course, they are, but only 48% of the general public got this answer correct. Right? Most people out there in Westwood and across to Utah and Montana and New Jersey think that we're not eating GM foods yet. And they are wrong. Do ordinary tomatoes contain genes? Only 40%. 40%. Isn't it sad? Isn't this sad? But, so, 60% believe that ordinary tomatoes, my organic tomato, does not contain genes. These people get to vote. Would a tomato with a fish gene taste fishy? Again, almost 60% of people say yes. If you take a gene from a fish and put it into a tomato, that tomato will now start to taste fishy. And this scares people. Right? But this is a good answer. Who was it that made earlier? That, yeah, good point. It's not simply the matter of transferring a gene. It's important to know, what does that gene do? And if that particular gene provided the essence of fish flavor, then sure, it would. If you ate a GM fruit, might it alter your genes? So again, more than half of ordinary consumers say, yes, if I ate a genetically modified food, it might change my own genes. And they go ahead and eat it anyway. That's even more bizarre. Can animal genes be inserted into a plant? This is a pure technical question. DNA from any organism is pretty much the same chemically, So you can take a fragment of that DNA from virtually any organism and insert it into virtually any other organism. The DNA doesn't know whether it came from a plant or an animal, but we do, only because we keep the records. If you looked at it under a microscope, you wouldn't be able to tell. If you did the sequence analysis, maybe you would be able to sort out what it was. Aiden?
Do you know when they discovered that all genes in all animals or in organisms were the same?
Well, not all genes are the same, but
Well,
DNA is the same.
DNA, yes, DNA
Yeah,
structure.
well, the basic structure, yeah, back in 1953 with Watson and Crick described DNA, and there are subtle distinctions. There are subtle distinctions at a chemical level and at that molecular level, but the gross chemical anatomy is the same in all organisms. How it's packed is different. I mean, you have chromosomes in plants and animals that you don't have in bacteria, but once you extract it and clean it all out, that long thread of DNA visually looks the same from everything. Okay?
What about the glowfish experiment?
Oh, I guess so. When
What
they
about
transferred?
all the things we talked about for the last 3 weeks?
I do understand that. I was just wondering if there was like a single like aha moment when they started looking at another gene and they saw that it was the same structure. Like I understand that the codons are different and that that you can put it into another animal and then that must mean that it like codes for the same thing. I was just wondering if there's like a specific aha moment.
Go ahead, Alan.
Okay, so 70% of our compatriots think that we can't technically transfer a gene from an animal into a plant. But of course, it's routine. We can do that all the time. And then when we asked an example of a GM food that's on the market, 79% said tomatoes. Interestingly enough, there are no genetically engineered tomatoes on the market at the moment. There was, the first high-profile product was the Flavor Saver tomato, of course developed in Davis, and that was on the market for a short time, but it is no longer on the market, and although a number of other genetically engineered tomato varieties had been developed and had gone through the regulatory approval process, none of those are currently on the market. So you might have been better off to guess some of the other options there.
I recently was in the supermarket and bought a low-fat avocado that had is that genetically engineered?
It's not genetically engineered. It would have to be genetically modified in the traditional sense of modification, in the ordinary English sense of modification. All new varieties have to, by law, be genetically different from what's already available. Otherwise, it won't be able to get a license. It won't be able to be released commercially. So there has to be some change to the DNA in order for a company or a university, a breeding station, USDA even, to develop and release a new cultivar. But genetically engineered, no. It is not genetically engineered in terms of using recombinant DNA technology to affect that reduced fat content. And plant breeders have been remarkably successful over the years, by the way, in creating virtually everything we eat. So it's not like they have very limited skills. Almost everything, as I say, almost everything we eat has been genetically modified through human intervention over the last 10,000 years to give us all the products that we have now, things that don't exist in nature. Most of the foods that we eat today do not exist in nature and probably could not exist in nature.
Is there a particular reason why tomatoes aren't on the market as genetically modified or genetically engineered?
That's a long question. A specific reason? No. I think for the most part, most of the companies that would be interested in this, and they tend to be small vegetable companies, are leery of the public controversy. Okay? We do have, and tomatoes are ubiquitous. I mean, virtually everybody eats tomatoes. Virtually every culture worldwide makes good use of tomatoes. So it's like genetically engineering or tinkering with a staple food. People are a little bit more concerned about that than if it's something that's minor, you only eat it a couple of times a year. Papayas, for example. Some papayas are genetically engineered. And there's not a big controversy over those papayas because nobody eats them every day. Well, maybe if you live in Hawaii. But for the rest of us, it's okay, well, if you have to genetically engineer those, that's fine. But don't touch my tomatoes. So that's the short answer. It's a little bit more complicated than that. But okay? So, oops. Like that. So we can distribute those things if you want now. Or we can do it later. Fine. My job is a public educator. I'm a scientist. I work for the University of California. I'm paid by taxpayers. Thank you very much. And part of my job is to encourage a rational debate over the benefits and the drawbacks of new technologies as they impact food production and agricultural production, particularly now that we have so many issues that are coming up in the public sphere, not only biotechnology, but we have climate change, we have sustainability, environmental sustainability, agricultural sustainability, economic sustainability. And people are debating these things and influencing where we are going through policy by first of all, by voting in their elected representatives, and then campaigning with their elected representatives to get certain policies in place. And that's fine. That's what democracy is all about. The problem is that too many people are ill-informed, and they end up making decisions and pressuring their elected representatives to follow a particular path of policy and support a particular policy when it isn't necessarily correct. And I do often see people actually campaigning against their own best interests. Okay? So it's not my job to tell people which way they should vote, but it is, to some extent, to provide information and then encourage people to educate themselves before they decide which way they're going to go. And that's, once they get to that point, I back off and say, okay, go to it, have a good debate. The problem is, when it comes to biotechnology and agriculture, we have not yet had that good debate. And that the previous slides illustrated that a large part of the reason is that people are so ill-informed in the first place. If you don't believe that tomatoes have genes naturally, then of course you would be leery when you hear about these scientists putting genes into our food supply, when genes are not a natural, when you believe genes to be not a natural part of the food supply. So we have these public perceptions that are often based on invalid assumptions. We also have a problem because many people fail to apply critical thinking. Now, I'm sure nobody in this room would be guilty of that, because part of the reason you're at university is to learn critical thinking skills and to not simply accept whatever the salesperson with a nice pitch feeds you. Right? It's a question of taking all available information and evidence, including the sales pitch, and putting it on the table and sorting it through and say, does this make sense? Does it stand up to scrutiny? Is it logically sound? Where does it fit in with the other information that I've obtained from this other salesperson from a different company? Are they conflicting or do they agree? And so often, and this makes me very sad when I talk to people in the general public, so often people don't apply very simple skills of critical thinking. I think this is something that we in the public universities have to take more seriously. And lack of context. Again, we're taking a single, very narrow datum of information and then developing a broad policy based on that single thing without looking at the context of, what's the other relevant information that comes to play on this. And, I use this illustration that I got from my friends in Syngenta who I was driving through Nebraska a few years ago, and I found this billboard. And the point is that, the farmer here is growing his or her field of corn. They use a pesticide, they spray it once, controls the insects, whereas the consumer, the lady here, is spraying what may well be the same chemical all over her body and is oblivious to a number of different factors. And this, the implication is that this lady is concerned about the food produced on this farm. So the context is crucial. She thinks nothing of applying this chemical directly to her body and numerous times in obviously a very high dosage, and that's safe. But a chemical applied to a farmer's field weeks or months before the food is actually harvested, and the chemical may be totally degraded by then, or maybe not. The amount of chemical exposure is going to be dramatically reduced with this one as opposed to this one. So we have to think about context as well. Where do people get information? There's common misconceptions abound. You hear, and I hear this fairly frequently, genetic engineering is unnatural because it breaks the species barrier set by Mother Nature. Right? Mother Nature doesn't allow genes to go from one species to another. Yet we're taking genes from fish and we're putting them into tomatoes. And that's scary. You hear that DNA is a complex protein. Huh? Is DNA a protein? No. So it can't be either complex or simple. It's not a protein. GMOs are commercialized with 3 months to 3 years of field testing and no long-term safety or environmental studies. So you also have the impact that, okay, these are new products, they might be harmful, and nobody's really studying them in any great detail. There's no real scrutiny, independent scrutiny of the safety, either to the food supply or to the environment. And we don't have people challenging that. Okay? Well, here's an example. Here's an example where we have the species barrier. This is ordinary bread wheat that we grow in this country. We find that many of the varieties actually have large tracts of genes that come from not only different species, but a different genus, rye. It's there. You see these, the stain here shows primarily the wheat chromosomes, but the yellow stain is there to indicate what portions of the chromosomes came from rye. Right? So a fragment of a chromosome from rye gets stuck into a chromosome from wheat. They all live happily together. And again, this is a product, this is not genetically engineering. This is something that occurs intentionally by human plant breeders who've been doing this for many years. And also it happens in nature. So if we're going to be concerned about genes going from one species to another, then we're going to have to start, investigating the other common foods and crops that we're currently producing that we've given no thought to. And there's many examples of this, by the way. Genes cross the species barrier naturally every day. It's not a big deal. Mother Nature doesn't mind. For the development and commercial release of a new crop variety, this is a picture of my desk. I've been involved in the development of a number of different new crops, very fortunately, working with colleagues. This is the file, the dossier that I had to submit to the regulatory agencies in order to get a variety approved and on the market for a commercial crop conventionally bred. It was not genetically engineered. It's about 30 pages of documentation, primarily showing that it was actually genetically different from what was already available on the market, and that the features of it were, at least superficially in the tests we did, safe. Right? And this product was it's obsolete now. Varieties typically last, in general, about 5 years before something else comes along. They're kind of like cars, models of cars. They lose their favor quickly, something else surpasses it. Well, this was my variety. It was grown on millions of acres. It was eaten by people around the world. And fortunately, nobody called in sick. Now, I also had the good fortune to work on a project using genetic engineering. and get my genetically engineered cultivar also similarly approved and onto the marketplace. And the dossier that compiled for that took this stack of documents in much greater detail than the previous one. So the regulatory agencies were able to ask questions to a much more stringent level, much more pointed level that required me to spend a lot of taxpayers' dollars acquiring this information to support the justification that this product was actually safe. So the next time you hear someone say, oh, those genetically engineered products, they get on the market without anybody scrutinizing them as to safety, food safety, or environmental safety, think of this stack of files that my lab and associates and I compiled over the course of several years. There is a long history of biotechnology fear-mongering. This, I'm not sure if you can read the date, 1980. 1980. Right? This was before there were any genetically engineered plants. Right? Scientists on the verge of creating plant people, combining genes. Now, this is not one of our usual scientific journals that that I publish in. I don't know, do you publish in this? No. John, do you publish in this? No.
Not recently.
No good. Well, this was 1980. Was that? Okay. Farmers know that there's a controversy around biotech crops particularly. So why would a farmer who's, after all, trying to make a living, trying to be a good steward of the land so he or she can pass it on to their children or sell it, why would they do something that would cause damage when they hear so many negative things about it? Well, there are some documented benefits of biotech crops. To most farmers see some increase in yield. Biotech crops were not designed, the ones that are on the market now were not designed for yield increase per se, but they get it kind of indirectly. And this is especially true in developing countries, not so much here in the US. Farmers who grow biotech crops typically report that they're spending less money on chemicals. Right? So the pesticides, they have cleaner fields, less dockage. Are you familiar with the term dockage? If you don't have a farm background, you're probably not. Right? It's just dirt in the grain. When you harvest, right, you're harvesting more than the actual seeds that you're going to eat. Right? There's weeds in there, dirt particles, glass particles, insect parts, some fungus, all kinds of things that you really don't want to think that you're actually eating, but you are. Dockage, if you have a large amount of dockage, you get downgraded and you don't get quite so much money for your product. Less fuel use. So the farmer isn't driving around on the tractor in the field because they're spraying less pesticides, and they appreciate not having to buy fuel the same way that we appreciate not having to buy fuel. With some of the genetically engineered crops available, there's less tillage. Again, tillage, is that another farm term, or are we all familiar with that? No. Tillage is digging up the ground to kill the weeds. Right? It means scraping the surface of the soil. The problem with tillage is it is very effective at killing weeds. And the weeds compete with the crop plants for nutrients, for water. The problem with tillage is that once you scrape the top of the surface, it exposes the soil to erosion from wind and from rain. Topsoil is an extremely valuable commodity in farms. There's only a certain layer of it, depending on where you are. It can be very thin, can be a little bit thicker, but nevertheless, once you lose topsoil, it's extremely difficult to come back. So if you're a farmer, you don't want to lose any more topsoil than you can help. But tillage exposes soil to these forms of erosion from the wind and the rain, and it's, there was a study a number of years ago, back in the 80s, I think, prior to biotech, and the results of that study was that soil erosion is the single largest environmental disaster that happens to the land. Mm-hmm. Pollution? Soil loss. With GM crops, with some GM crops, not all, and I hasten to add that I don't often make generalizations. Some GM crops allows allow the farmers to use less tillage. Conventional farmers either use chemicals to kill weeds, or they use tillage to kill weeds, or sometimes a combination of both. Some farmers don't want to use chemicals at all because they're too expensive, or they don't like the idea of chemistry, or they don't like buying product from these big chemical companies, philosophical thing, or because they're not allowed, if they're organic farmers, for example. And those people have to resort to tillage to control weeds if they want to get any kind of reasonable yield from their crop. And fewer adverse health effects. When China started allowing their farmers to grow particularly BT cotton, a form of genetically engineered cotton, they noticed that there was a dramatic drop in the number of hospitalizations of farm workers due to pesticide poisoning. Nobody really expected this. But upon investigation, I mean, it makes sense. You're growing a crop that doesn't require as many pesticides to keep the insects away, which means that you're not spraying as many of these pesticides, which means that your farm workers are not going out in the field with hand sprayers and being exposed to these, what can be, quite toxic chemicals. So in the absence of spraying for insects, the farm workers stay healthy. Global controversy. Biotech crops are continuing to grow year after year. More and more countries, more and more farmers are growing the products in spite of the controversies, in spite of what you read in the newspapers. But still, there are many countries that refuse to allow the cultivation of biotech crops or consumption of foods from biotech crops. And it's interesting, the policies in these countries. Chile is interesting. Chile allows their farmers to grow the crops, but their consumers aren't allowed to eat them, oddly enough. Most countries that have a ban on biotech products, on agricultural products, ban the cultivation. I mean, even in the European Union, which is so negative, typically, against the GM products, allow their people to eat genetically modified foods, some of them, improved ones, but most countries in the European Union cannot actually grow them. Chile is the counterexample where the farmers can grow the crops, but they have to all be exported out of the country. They're not allowed to be consumed domestically. Samantha? That's fine.
Okay, so with our homework and yesterday in discussion, we've been talking about transforming plants and putting in, transforming them with DNA that we can produce. We learned about a human blood clotting factor, and there's different genes, human genes we can grow inside plants in order to obtain them and use them to help with diseases and cure diseases. After we take away these certain genes from these plants, are we able to still eat these plants or use these plants?
Legally?
Yeah.
Or
I'm wondering.
medically. Typically, if a plant is genetically modified to produce a particular therapeutic protein, no, those do not get on the market. And this is true for animals as well. Right? We are genetically engineering animals for therapeutic uses, and even non-therapeutic uses like the cloning. Those things are not allowed to be consumed by humans at this point. There is still some argument about that and some discussion going on, but I don't think any of those products are going to be consumed by us. Now, what may be, and I don't know this for sure, maybe somebody else does, John, whether those plants can then be fed to animals, which is usually what happens with plant products. Once you harvest them for the grain or whatever human food component, the rest is fed to animals just to get rid of them.
Yeah, the answer is no.
The answer is no so far. Yeah. Or both, right? Some places are very strict, not allowed to have them at all. So why then do farmers grow GM crops? In the Philippines, if we look at that example, farmers look at a 30% yield increase using BT varieties of corn. These are Bacillus thuringiensis, they're insect protected, so farmers don't have to spray as much pesticide for insect control. I was in the Philippines when they had the first test results coming out of these varieties. These are the same varieties that our farmers in the Midwest are growing. right? So they're optimized for American Midwest growing conditions in Iowa and Nebraska. And the Filipino farmers were just given, bags of seed and say, not quite that casually, but let's try these and see how they work here in the Philippines. Obviously a very different climate, soil types, moisture levels, farm management, everything is very different. But those particular varieties out-yielded the local varieties by 30%. And I remember when this announcement was made at a scientific meeting, and I got up and I said, I have to question this. Because these crops, these corn varieties, are not designed to increase yield. So where's this yield increase coming from? Well, it was answered for me. It was answered for me. And we'll get to it in a moment. South Africa is another country that has been dabbling in genetically modified crops. They have both two types, the corn and the cotton, BT cotton. 77% higher returns. And here's where you see another popular misconception is you'll hear people say, well, these GE crops, they're designed for big farmers and big companies to make money, but the rest of us, they don't provide any benefit at all. In actuality, it turns out that the GM crops are scale neutral, that they provide a benefit across the board, and in certain cases, like in South Africa, it's the smaller farms that actually get a greater proportion of benefit. I'll explain that. Similarly in the Philippines, we'll come back to that in a moment. And then in China as well, they're seeing some higher yields there, not quite as dramatic as in the Philippines, but the reduction in the farm labor or poisonings is good news across the board. Everybody likes to read about that. So India as well, BT cotton. This is what it looks like. I got this slide from Gary Monkfold at Iowa State, who did some work in the Philippines. And this is what it looks like. You can see the genetically engineered row here, and the Filipino cultivar next to it has bacterial rot, suffering from bacterial rot. We don't, that's not a major problem here. But at harvest time, the Filipino farmers were able to get, a pretty good-looking harvest of this corn in comparison with what their regular varieties were producing, and this is when they're using pesticide. Okay? Now, the reason this looks so awful, and I presume that you would prefer to eat the corn from the previous slide as opposed to this, the reason this looks so bad is that the Philippines is one of the poorest countries in the world now, and farmers there are poor. They can't afford pesticides. So when they get a hold of pesticides at all, they use them very sparingly. Right? Our farmers in developed countries will use the amount they need to get the insect control. Not a drop more, because it's expensive to our farmers as well. But if they're seeing any dramatic impact from the insect, they will buy and spray more pesticide. In the Philippines, the Filipino farmers can't afford to do that. And these are the rich Filipino farmers, the ones who can afford to buy it at all. The ones who can't afford it at all simply go without pesticide. And they end up harvesting whatever the insects leave behind, which, so we've seen through the calculations, turns out to be 70% of what a good U.S. hybrid produces. So that's the difference. That's the distinction. Filipino farmers don't have to use pesticides at all, and they still get a pretty good-looking harvest out of it by comparison. So that's why the farmers are interested in this stuff. Not only do they not have to use as many toxic pesticides, but they're getting a much better looking harvest. Question?
I was wondering about the farmers in the field spraying the cotton. They had a lot of poisoning. So if the pesticides affected them that much, did it affect the consumers as well?
In China?
Yeah.
Who knows? Who knows? One of the issues we have with China is, it's a dramatically, quickly growing economy, very powerful. And they're pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into plant biotechnology, by the way. In fact, I'm going over there in a couple of months, paid entirely by the Chinese government. This is unheard of. But one of the things we have a problem with is the regulatory system. You know, and we've had these disasters that even the Chinese have suffered with, you know, the melamine, the milk, you know, the baby food, the pet food. You know, all of these things are indicative of an inefficient regulatory system. And that is something that the Chinese authorities are recognizing and saying, okay, we have to do something about this. So are consumers there suffering from the pesticides, the excessive use of pesticides, the older, more toxic pesticides? I don't think we have good information on that. I wouldn't be surprised, but I don't know. To consumers. Why do consumers get a benefit from biotech crops? Most of us in the U.S. don't see direct benefit when we eat a biotech corn or soybean. We get an indirect benefit because if you ask most consumers, would you support a food product or a crop that was grown with less pesticide? Most people would say, yeah, that's a benefit. I would support that product. But they're not aware of it typically. Consumers in other parts of the world get a more direct benefit. And I'm thinking here, the best example is in the BT corn again, because BT corn has documented less content of mycotoxins. Mycotoxins are produced when fungus starts to infect the grain. Right? And virtually all grain is susceptible to fungal infection. In traditional corn or non-genetically engineered corn, the fungus can get in, it infects the corn because the insects that have come by and started chewing on the corn injure the corn, right? Just like humans, if you cut your arm, you're more likely to get an infection than if you didn't cut your arm. Well, same with plants. And the insects come along and chomp away at the tissues of the corn plant. It exposes, it opens the tissue to any fungal spores that happen to be floating around in the air, and they're floating around all over the place. They land there, they grow, they produce these toxins, and it infiltrates through the food. Consumers then eat that food, and lots of nasty things happening there. A lot of liver damage. It can dissolve your liver and eventually lead to death. And this has been happening in Africa and some poor countries of Asia, where they don't have a regulatory system to monitor and reject food lots that have excessive mycotoxin content. In this country, we do. We don't hear about it, right? It doesn't get in the newspapers. But occasionally, we'll find out that a particular load of corn from a particular region will have excessive mycotoxins, and that load will be stopped. Right? We do have that regulatory system. Of course, if it didn't get stopped, we'd hear a lot more about it. So it's one of the examples of where our system does seem to work. We have greater regulatory scrutiny. Think back to those two dossiers that I showed you. The mere fact that the genetically engineered stack of files was compiled, first of all, by me and my staff, and secondly, looked at by regulators, indicates that if there was something wrong with this that we didn't expect in the first place, somebody would have picked it up somewhere along the line before it got onto the marketplace. That is much less likely. We have a much less degree of assurance or confidence with the conventional variety because nobody really looked at it. I mean, we did some superficial analyses just to make sure, but regulators didn't look at the health and safety impacts at all. So genetically engineered products, because of the intense health and safety scrutiny, by the time they are eventually approved and put on the market, consumers should have much higher confidence in the safety of them as well. Less pesticide, as I said, a lot of people prefer to support products that were developed with less pesticide, and because of that, you see a lot of environmental benefits. Right? You see less tillage, so there's less soil erosion, and you see fewer of these toxic chemicals in there. Benefits to the environment, keep talking about less pesticide. Safer pesticides. When you do use pesticides with the genetically engineered varieties, they tend to be the newer ones that are safer, as opposed to the older chemistries that were developed many years ago and are more suspect from a toxicological standpoint. The industry, by the way, does not talk about safety with pesticides. They have an agreement amongst themselves that we will not use the safety of a chemical in our marketing. So they're not going to say, you know, you should grow crops and spray with our pesticide because it's actually safer than our competitors. They don't do that. You'll never hear that. But nevertheless, every chemical has a certain amount of toxicity to it. Right? Everything is toxic. It's a question of dosage and just impact. So nothing is entirely benign. Again, less fuel usage for the environment. Increased biodiversity. This is an interesting one. If you look at a field, and again, I'm not talking about every genetically engineered crop, but if you look at a field of say, BT corn, where the farmer doesn't have to spray pesticides, right, the biodiversity can be increased because conventional farmers who do spray pesticides spray the entire 40 acres, 80 acres, 640 acres, whatever it is, and everything under that cloud of pesticide gets exposed to it. And a lot of species will suffer from that pesticide in addition to the particular single species or 2 or 3 species that might be damaging to the crop. Right? With the BT varieties, you're not spraying the pesticide. So if an insect population happens to be just passing through, or if they want to live in the soil, in the root zone, whatever, they're not bothered. They can do that. So you increase the biodiversity. There's more species there, and we're sustaining a wider variety of species. And again, people seem to appreciate this. And of course, once you do that, you have more insect species, you bring in birds, you bring in lots of other organisms that don't, as long as they don't interfere with the crop, the farmer is not going to be too perturbed by their presence there, and that increases biodiversity. So we have some sources there. We talked about allergens, right? In the labeling policy in this country is that if a food is modified, whether genetically engineered or conventional, to increase the amount of a naturally occurring allergen or toxicant, then it has to be labeled as such. So if we somehow increase the one of the proteins or several of the proteins in peanuts that makes them allergenic, then that food product has to be labeled, whether it's genetically engineered or not. So it's based on the features of the food itself and not the method of breeding that gave rise to it. But biotech can also be used to remove allergens. Right? I mean, allergens are typically proteins. Proteins are generated from the gene recipe. So therefore, if we remove the gene that's responsible for producing that allergenic protein, then the plant, the food, will not produce that allergenic protein, and sensitive consumers can then eat that product without being exposed to the allergen. They won't go into anaphylaxis, and their families won't sue the company. None of these products are on the market yet, but a broad range of them are under investigation for potential uses, and certainly peanut is one of them. The problem in doing this in many situations is that, and peanut is a good example, if you remove all the allergenic protein from the peanut, it tends to be a very high proportion of the protein in the food. So if you remove all those allergens, what do you have left? You may not have a viable plant anymore. You may not have what's recognized as a peanut. So that's one of the problems. There's also some technical problems. Most foods also carry...
Let's ask a question. Let's ask a question on the clicker.
Okay, what's our question? What are we going to
The question is yes or no. Should a genetically engineered peanut that has had all of its allergens removed, so it's hypoallergenic, be labeled as being genetically modified? Yes or no?
Oops, I've got to stop that first, don't I? Okay. Well, most people say yes.
So who said yes?
Who said no?
Rose.
I said, is it actually working? Yes. Okay. I said yes because
if I had a peanut allergy, thankfully I don't, but if I had a peanut allergy, I would not just blindly eat a peanut and be like, oh, maybe it doesn't have allergens in it. You know, like it needs to be labeled in order to A, show that it has no allergens in it, and B, I feel like I would be suspect of something saying, oh, it has no allergens in it, unless it said it was genetically modified as such, because I mean, how else are they gonna do it?
Okay.
Okay,
Who said,
Who said no?
no? Davis?
We both said yes.
Who said no? LA? Someone did.
Come on, own up.
Albert? Marvin? Someone did. Made a mistake again? Tiger? Well, I think it's interesting, and Alan pointed this out, about 6,000 people die every single solitary year due to allergens in peanuts, and yet there are hypoallergenic peanuts that have been developed by genetic engineering, and hypoallergenic soybeans that have been developed by genetic engineering, but they're never going to see the light of day in your grocery store because of the fear of the companies that would put them out there, in many cases, about consumer rejection just because of the method by which they were used. Rose?
Though, would consumers also reject it for a variety of other reasons? Like, as I said, if I was like deathly allergic to peanuts, I would not eat a peanut no matter what they said.
But
was
if
in it.
you were deathly allergic to peanuts, and you had a peanut that went through 10 years of testing and was approved for having no allergens in it, why would you be skeptical about eating it?
I still think I'd be suspicious, but that's, I don't know, that's me.
I actually agree with you. I mean, I have, my daughter will go into anaphylactic shock from eating not peanuts, but Brazil nuts. So I know what it's like to have the anxiety of, you know, maybe somebody's going to give her a, you know, something, cookie or something with Brazil nuts in it. My position on this, first of all, the FDA would require labeling on this, not because it was genetically engineered, but because there was a substantial difference from the composition, the chemical composition from regular peanuts. So it doesn't matter whether the allergens increase or decrease, or whether the vitamins go up or down, or whether the iron goes up or down. If there's a substantial change, then the FDA requires labeling in this country. Okay? Now, the problem I have with peanuts, if I were allergic to peanuts, or if my daughter were, I would be okay with an approved genetically engineered peanut, hypoallergenic, going in to make peanut butter, but not necessarily the individual peanut. We can talk about this later. And the reason I'd be okay with the peanut butter is because they're produced in large batches, and you can always test before it gets put into the jars and just check, right? It's homogeneous. You have a pretty good idea whether there's any residual allergen in there. Whereas with an individual peanut, you can't do that. So that's my argument for that. Virtually all foods we eat have what we call anti-nutritional substances. Right? Soybeans are full of these things. We don't like to talk about them. The food industry doesn't like to talk about it because we don't want to give consumers more anxiety about their food than they already have. And because we have done, and I'm talking about we, generally, food scientists, academic scientists, the industry, have done a pretty good job of keeping those anti-nutritional substances to a minimum. Now, you may have been noticing that, you know, I've been drinking my water here, and maybe some of you have done similarly. There's arsenic in this, measurable quantities of arsenic, right? Would you intentionally drink something that was contaminated with arsenic? Doesn't bother me, because I know the dose is so small, I'm not going to be harmed by it. Arsenic is in virtually all of our foods, measurable amounts. So again, going back to the toxicology, it's a question not of the presence, but of the dosage. Removal of pathogens, we can do those things. We mentioned about the mycotoxins. Signals for pathogens using nanotech opportunities. We can enhance nutrient content, right? You've heard about the golden rice with beta-carotene being developed particularly for use in Asia. India is developing a high-protein potato. Right? So you have cultures where people, they're not starving, right? They have plenty to eat, they have enough to eat, but the nutritional balance is off. So, you know, in certain areas of India, certain communities, people get plenty of starch from potatoes, but they're deficient in protein. Well, instead of trying to provide protein to these folks, why don't we just modify the potatoes so that they get both starch and protein at the same time? And this is not something that's going on in this country necessarily, but being driven by Indian scientists there. Lots of opportunities. Right? It's a technology. It's a tool. And like any tool, you can do lots of things with the tool. You like to do good things with the tool, but you can also do dangerous things with the tool.